the following session, this session is titled Citizenship and Classical Lutheran Education, and it's my privilege to introduce Dr. E. Christian Kopff. He has previously taught for 36 years at the University of Colorado, Boulder, in the Classics Department and Honors Department, emeritus as of 2019, I believe. From 2004 to 2011, he served as founding director of the university's Center for Western Civilization. His books includes The Devil Knows Latin, Why America Needs the Classical Tradition, published in '99, which hopefully many of you have read. And also perhaps you've read a translation of Joseph Pieper, Tradition, Concept, and Claim, 2008. He was awarded the designation of Magister Magnus from the CCLE in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kopff.
Thank you for that introduction. I have a feeling I helped participate in it at a certain stage. And good afternoon. We're here today to talk about classical Lutheran education, of course, and eventually from the aspect of its role in citizenship. Classical Christian education is distinguished by the range of its curriculum and the many areas in which its alumni have achieved distinction. The 7 liberal arts value both the arts of language, the trivium of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and the arts of mathematics, the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In 1999, the A&E television network selected what they called, quotes, the 100 most influential people of the millennium, end quotes. They actually couldn't come up with the whole 100, so there were people like Princess Diana there. I'm not sure how influential she was on the whole millennium. My favorite juxtaposition was number 36 was given to Elvis Presley. Number 37, just behind him, was given to Joan of Arc. Presumably, Graceland has been more influential than France. I'm certainly in favor of that idea, though I'd like to hear all the arguments for it. In fact, however, the top 20 names are pretty reasonable, and the top 10, I think, represented a real consensus chosen, we were assured, by a blue ribbon committee as to things we consider important and significant about European culture. Let me just run through them. The top 10 were from 10 to 1, 10 Galileo, 9 Copernicus, 8 Einstein, 7 Karl Marx, 6 Christopher Columbus, 5 William Shakespeare, 4 Charles Darwin, 3 Martin Luther, 2 Isaac Newton, number 1 Johann Gutenberg. They represent the areas of science, technology, exploration, literature, and religion. Art was represented by Leonardo at number 11 and Michelangelo at 19, and Adam Smith got in for economics at number 20. All of the top 10, and by the way, the 3 extra ones I mentioned, had classical educations. They read Latin, and most read Greek. It could hardly be a stronger, and this was not mentioned in the course of the show, by the way, but every single one of these figures, chosen for other reasons, in fact had a classical education. Martin Luther, who probably most of us would have put a tad or two higher than 3, but that's okay. You still get a medal at the Olympics if you're in the top 3. Martin Luther was an educational reformer before he became a religious reformer. German universities in his day studied the great philosopher-theologians of the late Middle Ages. Wittenberg taught the Via Antiqua of Aquinas and Scotus, while other universities privileged the Via Moderna of William of Ockham and Gabriel Biel. Luther began lecturing on the Bible in 1513. He soon converted Wittenberg to classical Christian education, then known as Renaissance humanism. He won over Wittenberg's leading Thomist, Andreas von Karlstadt. He persuaded the Elector Frederick to found a chair of Greek, filled by the brilliant young German humanist, Philip Melanchthon, who was a teenager. He was the Carlos Alcaraz of Renaissance humanism. Melanchthon's inaugural address in 1518 praised classical education. Ernest Schwiebert, in his book on the Reformation as a University Movement, comments, "This caused the development of an entirely new school in which the restoration of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew and the teaching of the Church Fathers were to be studied in the original languages in which they were written," end quotes. In fact, it was an extremely clever marketing success. If you wanted to study the great theologians of the 13th century, there were universities that taught them. If you wanted to study the more recent Via Moderna, there were others. But nobody was specializing in humanism, in classical Christian education. The result is hundreds of students started coming to Wittenberg, who was a small town, really out of the way of the main parts of trade and commerce. Luther was already quite a popular teacher. Melanchthon, by the early 1520s, was getting 600 people signed up for his courses. Now, at Ohio State, this would be quite normal, but in the university of those days, it was flabbergasting. They had difficulty finding rooms for his classes, with so many students signing up for them. So it was because there was no one else to go north of the Alps if you wanted to specialize in Renaissance humanism. Medieval education concentrated on producing priests, but Martin Luther always insisted on the importance of education for society, family, and government, as well as the church. Luther's two major works on education were, one, to the councilmen of all cities in Germany, that they establish and maintain Christian schools, 1524, and his sermon on keeping children in school of 1530. The sermon was aimed at parents. Both works insist that a classical Christian education, Renaissance humanism as it was called, is essential not only for pastors and teachers, but also for those in positions of authority in society and the family. In temporal authority, to what extent it should be obeyed, of 1523, to which he refers explicitly in the 1524 open letter to the German councilmen, Luther distinguishes between the two kingdoms or regimes, Reiche oder Regimenta, by which God rules the world. In the kingdom of the right hand, God rules repentant Christians, the word and sacrament, forgiveness and love. While in the kingdom of the left hand, he rules all human beings by human law, fear, and the sword. German lands, and indeed much of Europe, though not England, followed Roman or civil law, which was derived from Justinian's codification of Roman law, lost in Europe for centuries after the 6th century when Justinian lived, but rediscovered in the 11th century. Scholars think that a single manuscript was discovered in Bologna in Italy. A key figure in Roman law was the citizen, by the way, also central in Athenian law. Citizens were important in German free cities, but much of Germany was subject to hereditary feudal lords, so Luther bases his appeals to German councilmen and parents to educate youth for participation in government and society on a Christian's vocation to love his neighbor. For a century, many students of classical education imbibed the ideals of classical citizenship without being able to put them into practice. This changed, however, with the settling of North America, as Harvard's Samuel P. Huntington explained in his important last book, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. And let me quote Samuel Huntington just a little bit here. Quotes, "In Europe, existing societies accepted or rejected the Protestant Reformation. In America, the Reformation created a new society. Unique among countries, America is the child of that Reformation. Without it, there would be no America as we've known it. America was created as a Protestant society, just as, and for some of the same reasons, Pakistan and Israel were created as Muslim and Jewish societies in the 20th century. Its Protestant origins make America unique among nations and help explain why, even in the 20th century, religion is central to American identity in a way not as true of other Protestant peoples. America, said Tocqueville in an oft-quoted phrase, was born equal and hence did not have to become so. That's to Tocqueville. Huntington goes on, more significantly, America was born Protestant and did not have to become so. America was thus not founded, as Louis Hart argued in the 1950s, as a liberal, Lockean, or Enlightenment fragment of Europe. It was founded as a succession of Protestant fragments, a process underway in 1632 when John Locke was born. Lutheran ideas of government were introduced to America in the Mayflower Compact, signed on November the 11th, 1620, 12 years before Locke was born. Let me quote it. It's a short paragraph, but it's a paragraph that later is expanded and developed in the history of our country to lead to some very important documents. Quotes, "In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland King, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia," they were a little bit off in their geography, "do by these presents solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic." We covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, under which we promise all due submission and obedience, end quotes. And they sign their names, 41 names. The colonists affirm their loyalty to their sovereign, King James, but by means of a covenant, they form their own government, a civil body politic, employing Latin, English, and Greek to assert that they are a political, not an ecclesiastical, group or body composed of citizens, kiwes. They formed a community and they published its basic premises in writing. This is not an English tradition. England had, and still has to this day, no written constitution. The model of the pilgrims who signed the Mayflower Compact is the Augsburg Confession. In that document, subjects presented to a ruler a statement of fundamental religious principles. This president led the settlers of America to formulate their religious and political commitments and institutions in written and published form. It still influences us. The United States of America has a written constitution, as do all 50 states. Congregations of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod have a written constitution to which members subscribe, as the Pilgrim Fathers did. Protestant conceptions of what was later called separation of church and state did not aim at driving faith and Christianity out of the public square, but reflected Martin Luther's ideas of the two kingdoms or regimes, Reiche oder Regimenta. Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 13, with its statement that the pagan Roman state was instituted by God, is a fear to the evil, not the good, and was God's servant, shaped the views of Luther, Calvin, and America's founders. In the kingdom of the right hand, the church, the repentant and forgiven Christian is a believer. In the kingdom of the left hand, society, when that society is a republic, the Christian is a citizen. This is how the separation of church and state was understood by the founders and succeeding generations. This interpretation of the significance of Luther's teachings on the two kingdoms was argued in a sermon by Lutheran pastor Frederick L. Schaeffer, the pastor of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in New York City. Pastor Schaeffer wrote a sermon for Reformation Day, 300th anniversary, and delivered it and published it. Among the things he wrote, quotes, the spiritual blessings, the moral light, the religious and political liberty, and the words religious and political liberty are italicized in his published script. The religious and political liberty which we so eminently enjoy, and which in some degree Protestants and Christians at large possess, may be traced to the day which on this occasion we are assembled to celebrate. He means October the 31st, 1517. Exalting humanity will ever regard so memorable a day with joy and gratitude toward the sovereign arbiter of events, who can render all things subservient to his gracious and impervious purposes, end quotes. Pastor Schaeffer published his sermon and sent copies to various founders. James Madison praised Schaeffer's sermon in a letter sent to him dated December the 3rd, 1821. Of Schaeffer's sermon, James Madison wrote, quotes, it illustrates the excellence of a system which by a due distinction, to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way, between what is due to Caesar and what is due to God, best promotes the discharge of both obligations. A mutual independence is found most friendly to practical religion, to social harmony, and to political prosperity, end quotes. James Madison assented to an interpretation of the separation of church and state as formulated by Martin Luther with a humanist respect for the classical tradition and the Bible. Viewed thus, both religion and the state are essential for human flourishing. Both church and state are instituted by God, and neither should have a veto power over the other in their proper sphere. This vision of the separation of church and state leaves no opening for purging religion from the public life of society, nor, a fortiori, for, quotes, building a wall of separation between church and state, end quotes. That last expression is found in a letter penned by President Thomas Jefferson to Messrs. Nehemiah Dodge, Ephraim Robbins, and Stephen S. Nelson, a committee of the Danbury Baptist Association in the state of Connecticut, written in 1802. Thomas Jefferson wrote, inter alia, quotes, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. End of quote from the First Amendment. Jefferson goes on, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Congress thus inhibited from acts respecting religion, and the executive authorized only to execute their acts. I have refrained from prescribing even those occasional performances of devotion practiced indeed by the executive of another nation as the legal head of its church, but subject there, as religious exercises, only to the voluntary regulations and discipline of each respective sect, end quotes. Thomas Jefferson was not a member of the First Congress. Not establishing a particular religion or denomination is not the same as erecting a wall of separation between religion and the government. It certainly does not inhibit the Congress from acts respecting religion, and prima facie, forbidding performances of devotion prohibits the free exercise of religion. The first Congress that approved the Bill of Rights also reconfirmed the Northwest Ordinance, which asserted, I'm going to quote this more than once, quotes, religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of learning shall forever be encouraged, end quotes. What do schools do according to the Northwest Ordinance? They teach religion, morality, and knowledge. The same First Congress approved chaplains for itself and military chaplains for the army, so much being inhibited from acts respecting religion. Jefferson contemplated with sovereign reverence, in his words, his own misinterpretation of the First Amendment. His view should not be privileged over that of James Madison, who was a member of the First Congress, formulated the words of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, and oversaw its passage through Congress. If anybody knew what the First Amendment meant, it was James Madison. He wrote it. Right? Mr. Shakespeare, what is to be or not to be mean? If he gives you an answer, it'll be the right answer. Jefferson's wall of separation appeared in no legal document or court case and had no influence on U.S. law and practice, which was dominated by the Lutheran doctrine that God ruled society through his two kingdoms, church and state. It was only in 1940 that the Supreme Court incorporated the prohibition that Congress shall make no law into a restriction on the states. That's Cantwell v. Connecticut. In 1947, Justice Black, in his majority decision in Everson v. Board of Education, for the first time introduced into U.S. law Jefferson's metaphor of a wall of separation in his letter to the Danbury Baptists. 15 years passed before the court began issuing decisions that halted traditional practices at public schools, including non-denominational prayer, Engel v. Vitale, 1962, Bible readings and the Lord's Prayer, Abington School District v. Shemp, 1963, and displaying the Ten Commandments, Stone v. Graham, 1980. We need to understand the effects on citizenship of the repudiation of these traditions. The incorporation of the states into the constraints imposed by the Bill of Rights on the central government, the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law, entails the unilateral repeal of the 10th Amendment and is a serious blow against the principle of federalism. Equally disastrous is the move away from interpreting separation of church and state in the light of Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, where both church and state have important roles in the life of society by interpreting the separation with Jefferson's metaphor of a wall of separation. The founders' view of religion in public schools was found, as I've already said, but I think it's worth repeating, in Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance, passed by the Continental Congress under the previous form of government and reaffirmed by the First Congress. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. There are many passages among the founders asserting exactly the same things. One of my favorite is John Adams' wonderful letter to his good friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, in 1789, where they disagree on a lot of things, but they come together, and Adams knows they're going to agree on the subject of the U.S. Constitution with what George Washington has chosen to do in his first inaugural. And John Adams writes to Benjamin Rush, I wish with all my heart that the Constitution had expressed as much homage to the supreme ruler of the universe as the president has done in his first speech. The petits maîtres who call themselves legislators and attempt to found government on any other than an eternal basis of morals and religion have as much of my pity as can consist with contempt. Typical strong John Adams language. But in fact, he was only representing what really everybody said. And when he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, it begins acknowledging God. And most of those early constitutions imitated his Constitution for the state of Massachusetts. When the Supreme Court began to forbid prayers and Bible readings in public schools, many traditionalists predicted a future not of church-state neutrality, but rather of hostility. Justice Potter Stewart wrote in his dissent to Abington School District v. Shemp, and interestingly enough, Potter Stewart's brother Zeph was a longtime member of the Harvard Classics Department. Justice Stewart wrote, quote, a compulsory state education system so structures a child's life that if religious exercises are held to be an impermissible activity in schools, religion is placed at an artificial and state-created disadvantage. Viewed in this light, permission of such exercises for those who want them is necessary if the schools are truly to be neutral in the matter of religion. And a refusal to permit religious exercises, thus, is seen not as the realization of state neutrality, but rather as the establishment of a religion of secularism, or at the least, as government support of the beliefs of those who think that religious exercises should be conducted only in private, end quotes. And history has confirmed Justice Potter's prediction. Those of you interested in contemporary American literature will remember the episode of The Simpsons, where for various reasons Ned Flanders is made the principal of the local school, and Commissioner Chalmers is there from the district when Ned does the morning announcements, which he ends by saying, "And God bless you all." Well, of course, immediately Chalmers feels he must fire Ned because, as he says in memorable words, God has no place in a public school. People my age can remember when that was absolutely untrue. It was only in the 1960s that this began to be forbidden by the Supreme Court, basically making up new laws based on Jefferson's political letter to the Danbury Baptists. Samuel Huntington argued that if America is to maintain its distinctive way of life, it must preserve what he called Protestant values, even if Protestants become a minority. And so he wrote in his book, Who Are We? Quotes, "America was founded as a Protestant society, and for 200 years almost all Americans were Protestant. With substantial Catholic immigration, first from Germany and Ireland, then Italy and Poland, the proportion of Protestants declined fairly steadily. By 2000, about 60% of Americans were Protestants. Protestant beliefs, values, and assumptions, however, had been the core element, along with the English language, of America's settler culture. And that culture continued to pervade and shape American life, society, and thought as the proportions of Protestants declined. Because they are central to American culture, Protestant values deeply influence Catholicism and other religions in America. They have shaped American attitudes toward private and public morality, economic activity, government, and public policy," end quotes. Recent books have noted the dire plight of citizenship in the United States. Tony Woodleaf, in his book, I, Citizen, and Victor Davis Hanson, in his The Dying Citizen, both from 2021, are articulate and factual descriptions of the feeling of many, perhaps most Americans, that they are no longer self-governing participants in political decision-making on the local, state, and national level. The books are, in my opinion, less convincing in their suggested solutions for our current dilemma. Especially, they ignore the education that shaped the Reformation and the American founding. I got to participate in an interesting Zoom call organized by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute with Woodleaf and Hanson. And somebody wrote in the question, I can't imagine who that would be, what about classical Christian education? Wouldn't that be important for citizenship? And Woodleaf's response was typical. You don't have to be a scholar to be a citizen. No, it helps to be educated if you're a citizen, however. I say this, Hanson did not contradict him. We know that Dr. Hanson has written with John Heath the book, Who Killed Homer, which is a praise of the classical tradition and a lament for its lessening influence on American education. So I could say we know what he really thinks. He didn't think that was the place to go fight for it. And his book does not discuss that issue. More recently, Pete Hegseth and David Goodwin, in their book, Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation, from 2022, devote many pages to chronicling the hesiotic progression of American education and perhaps, in my opinion, underestimate the vitality of classical education in America before the cultural catastrophe of the 1960s. They urge us to return to classical Christian education in private, parochial, and congregational schools as essential for confronting America's political and social problems, and are quite explicit about it. Let me turn for a minute back to the time of the founders. Historian Clinton Rossiter described the founders' education In his book, Seed Time of the Republic, The Origin of the American Tradition of Political Liberty, published in 1953, but still quite readable and quite relevant. Here's his description of college in the time of the end of the colonial period. Quotes, "It's easy to smile at the dull, rigid, crabbed methods that prevailed in colonial colleges, but if we judge the vineyards by the fruit they brought forth, we must acknowledge them a fertile ground of learning, science, reason, and liberty. They may not have taught young men enough useful knowledge, but they did teach them, in their tradition-written way, to think, communicate, and lead. To think, communicate, and lead. The roll call of Harvard and William and Mary men in the Revolution should be evidence enough that Latin, logic, and metaphysics were a rich fertilizer in the cultivation of reason, virtue, honor, and love of liberty," end quotes. Not a bad recommendation for any college. Progressive educators focus on liberating students from the bondage of tradition and the dead hand of the past. They ignore the history of the Athenian democracy, the Roman Republic, and the American founding, where students learn how citizenship functioned in other times and what problems it faced. Studying Greek and Latin is not just a linguistic exercise. The subjects that are read teach the art of citizenship. In Clinton Rossiter's words, to think, communicate, and lead. Let me give two examples of the ways the traditional classical curriculum not only taught linguistic mastery, but also prepared students for a life of citizenship. The typical second-year Greek text, after you'd gone through 1 year of grammar, was Xenophon's Anabasis. It starts off perfectly with very simple troop movements wandering around Asia Minor while you review last year's grammar, some of which has been forgotten over the summer. And then, before long, we're following a group of Greek mercenaries who've been hired by the younger son of the Persian monarchy. His name was Cyrus, like the famous Cyrus of the 6th century, to respond to problems he was having as satrap of Asia Minor. In fact, it's quite clear before long that they're not doing anything in Asia Minor. They are marching to the middle of the Near East, to the Euphrates River and the headquarters of the Persian Empire. And it's clear, as Cyrus eventually admits to the mercenaries, that his intent is to stage a coup against his older brother Artaxerxes, overthrow him, and replace them. And if he wins, he promises them very exciting rewards if they go with him. Well, they are mercenaries after all, and they agree to go with him. A battle is fought between the Greek army of Cyrus and the mixed army of Artaxerxes, and the Greeks win. A lot of what goes on there is a prediction of what's going to happen in a couple of generations when Alexander the Great shows up with the Greek army to face the Persians in the latter part of the 4th century. Unfortunately, at a certain point in the battle, Cyrus sees his brother Artaxerxes. And those of you who deal with family problems and sibling rivalry, I hope never have to face this situation. He sees his brother and charges out ahead of everybody to attack him. And guess what? Artaxerxes' bodyguard kills him. So at the end of the battle, the Greeks have won the battle. They hold the battlefield. That's winning the battle. Unfortunately, their commander-in-chief, who was going to set them up as chiefs all over the Near East, is now dead. So what do? Well, Artaxerxes invites them to come to a meeting where they can discuss how to handle this situation. For obvious historical reasons, which everyone here will understand, none of the Greek leadership had seen The Godfather. So they didn't understand that when Mr. Barzini offers to set up a meeting in Tessio's land in Brooklyn, where Michael Corleone will be safe, that isn't the intent of the meeting. Michael Corleone, fortunately for him, figures out what it means, but unfortunately these people had not read it. You might want to show the movie in class if you're reading Xenophon's Anabasis. Gives them an idea of what happened. The third book begins. For the first time in book 3, we meet Xenophon Athenias Tis. Xenophon, a certain Athenian. And he can't get to sleep naturally enough because they're trapped in the middle of the Near East. They've lost all of their leadership. What's to be done? So he calls together his friends. His friends call a meeting. The soldiers discuss, debate, and vote new leaders. Within 24 hours of the massacre that is supposed to leave the army completely helpless without leadership, so they would have been had the Persian forces lost all their leaders, they have discussed the situation, thought about a way to get out of it, and chosen new leaders. Xenophon is one of them. And they then began, for the next two books, this fantastic march from the middle of the Near East to the sea. As Greeks in those days, they knew the sea very, very well. And the whole thing is extremely exciting, among the most interesting and lively historical writing in the ancient world, and culminating at the end of the fourth book when Xenophon at the back hears people shouting wildly, and they're shouting. He writes in Greek, so he says thalata, thalata, but most of them were Spartans, and they were going thalassa, thalassa, the sea. For the Greeks, they'd made it. Now, in fact, there's a lot more books to go, and usually you won't get through that in the second year. But it's extremely exciting and lively, and it also, at the same time as teaching you and your students a lot of Greek, also teaches them what it's like to grow up in a culture of citizenship, where when there are problems, you get together and debate and discuss and vote. Third year Latin in the traditional curriculum was Cicero. And you usually begin with the first Catilinarian, which is a wonderful speech to read and exciting. And even people that don't know Latin often know O tempora, O mores, which Cicero cries out at one point in the first paragraph, oh, the times, oh, the morals, how things have gotten. As Cicero, a civilian leader, the first member of his family ever to hold high office, very unusual in Rome, faces an attempt to overthrow the government. The leader, Catiline, is in Rome trying to get Cicero and other people assassinated. He's also negotiating with the Gauls, who are Rome's great enemies. And he has an army in Etruria, north, modern Tuscany, north of Rome, ready to come when the time is right. This, if I may say so, is a real insurrection. It wasn't a guy with a Viking helmet wandering around the Roman Senate. It wasn't like that at all. Right? I mean, that's an insurrection with us. For them, there was a real army there. And the great thing that Cicero did, we have his 4 speeches to the Senate and to the people. We also have the historian Sallust's monograph on the Catilinarian conspiracy. We know exactly what went on. Cicero is able to, and what we don't have in the sources, by the way, is the fact that the great General Pompey is in the Near East arranging it for Rome, and he is waiting for an excuse to be called back to Rome to save it using his army in a special command. And Cicero manages to stop the revolt, drive Catiline out of Rome, get things set up so that his associate, a member of the Antonius family, the same family as Mark Antony a generation later, who is like Mark Antony, rather a drinker, but a good soldier, and using just the ordinary civil means, along with an army raised by the elected consuls, they stop the conspiracy. It's a great lesson of what a healthy civilian citizenship society can do in times of crisis, and you also learn a lot of Latin at the same time. Cicero himself is a fantastic figure to learn about, and for students to learn about. It isn't only now that one finds out about it. If we can go back to the Pilgrims who signed the Mayflower Compact, they had some tough times at the beginning. They thought they were in the northern parts of Virginia. They knew that Virginia and South Carolina had a warm climate, had soil rich with money crops like tobacco and rice, and that's what they looked forward to. Instead, they got Massachusetts. It was cold in the winter. The soil was hard and had to be worked hard to get a living. They were lucky enough not to have the forest fires from Canada in those days, so there was some advantages they did have. But after about 20 years of hard work, by the way, described in a great work of American historical literature, William Bradford's Of Plymouth Foundation, They were ready, one, to form a more regular constitution, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, and they were ready to form a college, Harvard College. And granted this situation, trying to keep their small farms going, trying to make a living, keeping an eye on the Indians, what was the first requirement for getting into Harvard College in 1642 when it was founded? And the very first requirement was, quotes, be able to read Tully, or such like classical Latin author extempore. Tully is Cicero. He's Marcus Tullius Cicero, and he's Tully just like Livius is Livy, and Plinius is Pliny, and everybody in the 18th century called him Tully. We give him his last name now. This is what the first thing. You couldn't get into Harvard. You didn't have to show you could have your own farm. You didn't have to be a good tradesman. You didn't have to show you were a brave Indian scout. You had to be able to read Cicero. That's what they thought was important if they were going to have a civilized society grow up around them. And my understanding from what I hear that Harvard's been pretty successful. Maybe you've heard that from a few people. A Cicero entrance exam requirement for college doesn't exactly fit with the image of America's founders as living a life free from the dead hand of the past. In 1783, yes, back in the time of the founders, French immigrant Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, in his Letters from an American Farmer, asked the famous question, what then is the American, this new man? And he answered his own question, as teachers tend to do. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. Some hundreds of years later, Dinesh D'Souza, in What's So Great About America, echoed de Crèvecoeur's words. Dinesh wrote, quotes, as the American founders knew, America is a new kind of society that produces a new kind of human being. That human being, confident, self-reliant, tolerant, generous, future-oriented, is a vast improvement over the wretched, servile, fatalistic, and intolerant human being that traditional societies have always produced and that Islamic societies produce now. End quotes. I would say something intolerant, but I'm too servile, of course, to do that. Of course, this isn't true. We've heard, in fact, from Clinton Rosser excellently how important the past was and how important it was that the educated people in the colonies know about that past. Today, we think the future will belong to those who innovate, and so our education must be innovative. A progressive educator wants to liberate students from the dead hand of the past. Since Edward Thorndike and Robert S. Woodworth in the 1920s, educational research has been used to oppose the classical curriculum. An interesting exception may be provided by the research of psychologist K. Anders Ericsson of Florida State on what he calls experts, by which he means acknowledged masters in many different occupations. Ericsson considers himself the academic expert on experts. His research studies the most successful practitioners of a wide range of different skills and professions, ranging from policemen to the relatively neutral area of chess. Chess is a challenging intellectual activity. Winning involves making moves that your opponent does not anticipate. The communis opinio is that grandmasters win by thinking ahead more moves than their opponents. Ericsson's research, however, shows little correlation with innovation, but significant correlation with hours spent playing over and over the games of earlier past masters. Let me give a summary of his work from Joshua Foer's book, Moonwalking with Einstein, which is about memory. Quotes, using magnetoencephalography, a technique that measures the weak magnetic fields given off by a thinking brain, researchers have found that higher-rated chess players are more likely to engage the frontal and parietal cortices of the brain when they look at the board, which suggests they are recalling information from long-term memory. Lower-ranked players are more likely to engage the medial temporal lobes, which suggests they are encoding new information. End quotes. Let me summarize. Amateur chess players innovate. Grandmasters remember. Outstanding achievement involves knowing the past. By immersion in the past, the classical canon aims at creating grandmasters of citizenship. If the goal of education is to produce what I've called Grand Masters of Citizenship, what Clinton Rossiter talks about as teaching students to think, communicate, and lead, to cultivate reason, virtue, honor, and love of liberty, we must acknowledge Cicero is the Grand Master of Citizenship non-pareil, and the study of him is extremely useful for people who are citizens in any society. Some conservatives want to respond to the crisis of citizenship by adding a semester of civics to the high school curriculum. In my opinion, this is to treat the knowledge future citizens need as a game of Jeopardy. Factual knowledge of the structure of our government is important but insufficient. Students need to learn from history and great literature about the challenges and triumphs of consensual governments. This requires not only US history, but also the history of the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, as recorded by great historians like Herodotus and Thucydides in Greek, Sallust, Livy, and Tacitus in Latin, and exemplified by statesmen like Xenophon, Demosthenes, and Cicero. And to give him some good plugs here, if you look at Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, read the chapter on education. All citizens need to know the history of free institutions. Ones who are going on to college need to know Greek and Latin, and he has a great defense of learning Greek and Latin. But everybody, even the ones who have to start working when they're younger, need to know the history of the great institutions of Athens and Rome and England. We are free and creative as a people, not because we inhabit, quote, a new nation dedicated to a proposition, end quotes, as somebody once said, but because we are citizens of what General MacArthur called the United States in his last great speech at West Point in 1962. MacArthur spoke of America as this beloved land of culture and ancient descent. Not a new country, ancient culture and ancient descent. John Adams wrote to his friend Dr. Benjamin Rush in the same letter in which he praises Washington's first inaugural about a subject they disagreed on. He writes to Rush, "I should as soon think of closing all my window shutters to enable me to see as of banishing the classics to improve Republican ideas," end quotes. C.S. Lewis told his radio audience in 1942, in words which are now reprinted in Mere Christianity, Lewis spoke, "We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road, and in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive," end quotes. The current, typical Lewis sense of humor, right? The current crisis of citizenship cannot be resolved or ameliorated by adding a semester course on civics to the standard public high school curriculum. We're on the wrong road. We have privileged job training over the liberal arts, technology over great books, the consensus of self-proclaimed experts over the wisdom of our ancestors, consumerism over citizenship, computer studies over Greek and Latin. It's time to turn around and go back to the right road. We'll recognize the road when we get there. You see, it's the road home. For our students who are being educated for a life as future believers and future citizens, that road is classical Christian education. That road is classical Lutheran education. Thank you for your kind attention. About 10 minutes if people want to ask questions, raise objections, walk out in protest. Sorry.
How would you address the criticism that a classical education is racist and promotes white supremacy?
Well, I mean, there are two issues here. One is that there's a certain group that simply uses that objection to every single thing they don't like, no matter what it is. But we're dealing with access to cultures that have existed for thousands of years all over the world, the Roman Empire, but also the Roman Republic. The Roman Empire was founded by the Roman Republic. All different kinds of people of all sorts. And if they get around in college, they probably won't do it in high school, to reading Terence. They can read some very good comedies written by a black guy from North Africa. We're not 100% which one of the groups it is, but he certainly was not an Italian. And I think that there is, unfortunately, I've just sent off by our library loan, there is a book out there, and I haven't gotten it yet, talking about how important it is for black people to start reading the classics. Because this is the culture we're part of, and there's no inherently biological side to it. The ideals of citizenship, of the virtues, of the two kingdoms, of vocation, these are all things that are true of everybody. And the best way to get together, what we're doing is insisting on setting up a society that's obsessed with what the color of your skin is, and we seem to be rather confused about the sexual business, but anyhow, we're certainly obsessed with that. And the answer is, classical education has been important for all kinds of different people. And the best way to bring the world together is to allow countries to maintain their own individual traditions, but to do it under the guise of the 7 liberal arts. So I don't think, I mean, the alternative is to really emphasize race. That's what the public schools are doing now. And that's one of the reasons why Hegseth and Goodwin are saying, you know, you can't go to the public schools anymore. They're the ones promoting people being obsessed with their race. So that's what I would say. Interestingly enough, let me throw this out. Italy has a wonderful set of public classical schools called gymnasia. And it was set up in the 1930s by a wonderful educator named Giovanni Gentili. And so sometimes when people attack classical education in Italy, they say it's fascist, because the last stage of setting up the schools happened in the 1930s. In fact, of course, the curriculum is thousands of years old. Right? It goes back to St. Augustine and Martianus Capella, and you know all these figures, and no one takes it seriously. I mean, it's the kind of thing you say when you don't have a good argument, right? Isn't it? Comments, questions?
Mortimer Adler has a really good treatment of that question in the introduction to the great book.
He does. Good. Yeah, he was sensitive to those issues, but you know, it's not relevant to what we're doing. Please.
The Black Intellectual Tradition by Drs. Prather and Parnham. And Dr. Prather also has another book about reading the classics with African Americans. So these are both female African American scholars, and they wrote a great book with the Black Intellectual Tradition.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you. Still waiting. I just got news that through a library loan that just came into the Boulder Library, but I'm here, not there. So, okay, great. Other comments, questions? Yes, please. Down here.
Mentioning chess players and memory versus innovation, and the names are hazy to me, but in the Greek mythology, isn't memory the mother of the muses?
Yes. Mnemosyne is the mother of the muses, and that's exactly right. Although in one sense the Greeks were very creative, they were creative in the sense of telling stories about their what we call mythical past. For them it was historical, and so Athens and its democracy in the 5th century is doing all these things for the first time and having a much larger group of the population participate in things. But when they gather together as a people to see the great serious works of especially Aeschylus, the Oresteia is a great attempt to explain Athenian democracy by rethinking the great myths. And there's a wonderful German historian named Christian Meyer who's written about this, and all this stuff gets translated. But even in the case of Sophocles, is there a greater scene in Greek literature than the scene where Creon asks Antigone what she thinks she's doing, disobeying the government? because she wants to do her job, her vocation as a member of the family of burying her brother. And she gives this fantastic speech. That was your decree. Zeus did not make that law. Decay, justice, did not make that law. The laws that say that it's the woman's job and the family's job to bury the dead, they go back into the past and no one knows where they came from. And it's basically the same argument that the Reverend King uses in the letter from the Birmingham jail. There is justice which state may not veto. And that's what Luther tried to make clear by his work on the two kingdoms, is to show how far, because the name of the work, remember, is temporal authority, how far it should be obeyed. That tells us right away there's an extent in which you say, as Antigone said, as Socrates said, who also said to the Athenian people, gentlemen of Athens, I admire you and I love you, but I must obey Apollo, who told me that my life's mission was to question rather than men. And it's no accident that an educated historian like Luke has the apostles say exactly the same thing to the Sanhedrin. We must obey God rather than men. So that's, and we find it in the Athenians, in their plays, in the Oresteia, in the Antigone, these which are great works of poetry, but they're also rethinking the life of the citizen in terms of the mythological past. Somebody had something in the back, please.
There's a Nebraska senator named Ben Sachs who published a book in 2018 called The Vanishing American Adult, and it talked about the changes in the education system. I wondered if you were familiar with it.
I don't know that particular one, but he's obviously dealing with an important theme. The works that I've looked at to prepare for this are Woodleaf's I, Citizen, Victor Davis Hanson's Dying Citizen. And Hanson's book especially is interesting because he not only goes over the importance of the citizen and its ancient roots, because he's a classicist, he's a PhD in classics, but he also goes over what the options are if you don't have it. And you end up being a peasant, you get a situation where legal immigrants are treated the same as citizens, and he has a very interesting discussion of why that isn't a good idea, why citizen needs to be a very special and preserved and protected and educated class. And he then also thinks about what the future could bring if we don't defend citizenship in this country. And he's very good at being depressing. He's one of the most eloquent, depressing people I know. I wish he would occasionally get a little happier about things and try to look forward to it. Because what we're doing is, in fact, we're not only helping our own church, and we know that, and the things we believe, we're helping the whole country. The whole country needs what we have to say. And James Madison knew that. He knew that among the most essential things in America, the way the church and state interact and are separate, goes back to Martin Luther. And that's something we need to start reminding people about and stop being so modest, which I think we are sort of too much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I really enjoyed this today. Thank you.